This is the second lecture for Friday, April 24th. And we're looking at biodiversity, the importance of biodiversity. We looked at some of it was redundant with what we looked at earlier in the semester, where we saw the benefit of maintaining a species diversity, species richness within communities. Some of the same reasoning for arguing in favor of maintaining biodiversity and making the point, making the argument, convincing somebody that biodiversity has value, that it's important. So, for different reasons, people generally agree that there's some value in biodiversity, whether it's for selfish reasons of having some drug that's going to cure cancer, or the more altruistic reasons of valuing other species and recognizing that we're not the only species here. But either way, most people agree that there's some value of biodiversity. So then the question is, what do you do to maintain biodiversity? How do you conserve biodiversity? There's no easy answer to this. We're going to look at a couple of different approaches, that have been taken by different groups, different governments, different agencies, nonprofits, conservation groups. So first of all, if biodiversity is important, then one of the main ways that you can maintain biodiversity is setting aside some areas that are safe from development, or where development is going to be controlled, so that these species don't lose out, and that you don't have species disappearing, but you have biodiversity maintained. But how do you go about doing that? One approach is this is the world as a whole, which is hard to get anybody to agree with some of these things, but is to identify certain countries where there's parts of the land or parts of the water, the ocean, that are particularly diverse. There's a lot of biodiversity there. And there's certainly countries around the world that have really high levels of biodiversity for different reasons. Part of it is biological, some of it is sociological, has to do with the country and development there. It's a combination of factors, but there's a number of different countries: Mexico, Ecuador, Colombia, Brazil, Peru, and China. A lot of these near the equator, where there are a very high level of biodiversity in these countries. If you look within the borders of those countries, there are a huge number of species. And if you add 6 other countries to this, that's not very many countries altogether. But that handful of countries depends on what you're looking at, but those countries account for as much as 70% of the species that you find on Earth, inland, on land, or in the water. Depends on whether you're talking about fish or whether you're talking about mammals or birds. But that is a lot of biodiversity in a few countries. And so some people make the argument, you know what, we should really concentrate on these countries. If we have economic incentives for these countries, if there's a lot of conservation groups working in these countries, if there's a benefit for these countries to conserve these species, such as ecotourism and those kind of alternate benefits from maintaining biodiversity, then that's what we should do. Focus on these countries because they're more important than other places. Part of the problem is that some of these countries, a lot of other countries where there's the highest biodiversity, are poor. Now we have the luxury of saying, I'm not going to eat at McDonald's because they're cutting down the rainforest to raise cows, and that's where I'm not going to get, or I'm not going to go to Starbucks because they give me styrofoam cups, or whatever the choices are that you're making. Maybe you go to Starbucks because they give you paper cups, and you don't go to Dunkin' Donuts because they give you styrofoam cups. Whatever choices you're making, some of those are, for some people, are really geared towards some kind of environmental conservation. So we can do that. We can eat this or don't eat that. You're a vegetarian, you're vegan, you don't eat this, you don't eat that. We can make those choices. But in a lot of these countries, the decision for the people there is whether to feed their family or not. Now, that's not a choice that we're making very often. So in a poor country, they don't have the luxury of maybe making some of the decisions that would favor conservation and maintain biodiversity that wealthier countries have. Another problem is just because you have a lot of different species doesn't mean that you have a lot of species that are found nowhere else in the world, these endemic species. This is a point that I brought up before. So there's some attractiveness to this kind of approach. Well, let's choose these countries. We'll place a lot of emphasis on these countries that have a big presence there, try and convince the government of these countries and the people of these countries to really have this strong environmental conservation point of view. Well, another approach is not to pay any attention to the borders so much, but to target areas of biodiversity. Some of these span multiple countries, these areas. And there's biology groups, ecology groups, conservation groups, scientific groups that have covered a lot of the world. And they've done surveys of different species. Basically, they've quantified biodiversity in different areas of the world, a lot of different areas. And there's these hot spots of biodiversity that have been identified around the world, both on land and in the ocean. And according to some of these major conservation groups and scientific organizations, there's about 25 endemic hotspots. These areas of special concern, special interest, not because they have a lot of species, but because they have a lot of species that are found nowhere else in the world. They're endemic. And that these 25 hotspots, not as much land as these countries that we were talking about before, so maybe easier to set aside, and just parts of countries, not entire countries, but just parts, that if you can preserve these endemic hotspots, if you can identify them, if you can outline the boundaries of these endemic hotspots, and you can put a lot of effort into conservation of species there, then you're not just saving numbers of species, but you're saving unique species. And it's a small portion of land or water in the world where you find these endemic hotspots. And so if you quantify the proportion of endemic species, 35 to 45% of endemic species in 1.5% of the land area on Earth. Now that seems like it'd be a good investment. There's going to be a lot of pushback between trying to say, well, we're going to preserve this area, no development. There's going to be a lot of pushback there. But if it's only a very small percentage of the land mass, 1.5%, then the odds of success are greater than if you're talking about much larger areas. And so there's this idea. This has a lot of attractiveness. Forget about the countries. We're not going to do this on a country-by-country basis, but we're going to do this not just number of species, but endemic species, and we're going to target these hot spots. That's what we're going to do. Well, another approach is recognizing, okay, there are certain countries that have a lot of species. There are certain areas that have a lot of endemic species. But you know what's even more important is that some of these areas are really threatened and other areas are in pretty good shape. So we definitely need to take that into consideration. And let's not just target the countries or areas of high biodiversity, but first let's identify the areas that are especially vulnerable or susceptible to this the areas that deserve the most attention because it's the most pressing that those areas be targeted for conservation. And so base our efforts for conservation and maintaining biodiversity on the threat to declining biodiversity and identify those areas. And again, there's conservation groups, there's scientific organizations that have gone around and identified areas where there's a high threat to biodiversity. And so there's argument for this. Let's target specific areas that are under siege, that are really in danger of biodiversity declining greatly. Most of these are in tropical places or subtropical places, just like you find with the endemic hotspots, and pretty much like you find with the number of species, areas, the countries that have the highest biodiversity. So there's a lot of overlap. Maybe you don't have to choose between these three different approaches, and because you'd be accomplishing a lot of the same thing. Or by choosing the same area, you could accomplish A, B, and C all at once. Well, other people make the point that, you know what, it really depends on what it is you're talking about. What species, what groups of organisms are you talking about? So there's these hotspots. Here's a map that shows these 25 hotspots around the world. Some of these World Heritage sites with a lot of different species, a lot of endemic species. There are also those countries that have a lot of different species, and then there were those threatened areas. But really, what are you talking about? If you're talking about plants, then there's certain areas where plants are particularly important. The Andes. You can look in this table if you want to look at the different types of organisms that are especially biodiverse in these different areas. If you're talking about mammals, that's a whole different situation. If you're talking about things in the ocean, fish, for instance, that's a whole different area. If you're talking about birds, that's a different area. Amphibians, same thing. So it gets to this question of, well, what is it that we want to protect? Are there certain organisms that are more important than others? And if you're choosing one area and say, okay, this is a really good, high biodiverse area, an area with a lot of endemic species, then maybe a lot of those are plants, but it's not such a good area for animals, or maybe it's the other way around. So it's certainly something to take into consideration, is which types of organisms are found in these areas. Okay, this leads us to the third topic here, which is, let's say that you agree, or humans as a whole agree, that biodiversity is important. Let's say that we've come to some agreement as to how we're going to go about conserving biodiversity, or how we're going to maintain a certain level of biodiversity. Well, we also need to take into consideration things that are going against biodiversity, and what is responsible for biodiversity declining is that species are gone. If it's a matter of the distribution of that species being changed, that's one thing. But there's a lot of species throughout the years, especially as the human population has increased, where those species just aren't, it's not a matter of them not being found there anymore. This species isn't found in Rhode Island anymore. Its distribution is limited to Maine or whatever. But these species have vanished from the face of the earth, or in other words, they've gone extinct. Now, that's something you can't change. Extinction is forever. They're gone. Maybe when we develop some genetic methods where we can bring species back that are extinct from their DNA, but we're a ways away from being able to do that. So I want to look at this idea of extinction. We'll look at a number of different topics having to do with extinction. The first one being the scale of extinction. This is just to put things in perspective. Well, as I said, a lot of the decline in biodiversity is associated with extinction. It's not just reducing the habitat or the distribution that a species has, but it's driving it virtually to extinction, that it's gone. There's a huge amount of extinctions that have taken place as a result of human activity. This is something that we're going to focus on. So, if you have species that are vanishing from the face of the earth, obviously that's causing biodiversity to decline. And it's not something that's reversible, because once you're gone, they're gone. And so, just like we saw, there's a lot of interest in reducing biodiversity declines or maintaining high levels of biodiversity. There's also a lot of interest in not just keeping the number of species up, but reducing the number of species that go extinct. And so if you think about the things that we've covered in this course, why is some population, some species prone to go extinct and other ones aren't? What kind of characteristics does a species have that lends itself to being wiped out from the face of the earth? It's no longer there. There's no more individuals. So this has to do with population ecology, has to do with community diversity, and the different things that affect the ability of a species to exist in a community. It has to do with biodiversity, the topic that we're talking right now. And then in terms of a topic that we spent a considerable amount of time looking at, it has to do with life history characteristics. How fast do they reproduce? How big is their population? Those kind of things. So understanding why a species goes extinct, understanding why one species is vulnerable to extinction, another one much less so, we can call upon a lot of things that we learned earlier in the semester. I have a lot better understanding of this. There's a lot of examples of extinction. We looked at the heath hen earlier in the semester. There are a lot of species that have gone extinct. We'll look at a few more examples throughout this talk, some today and on Monday as well. But here's an example. You might think, this is what people thought exactly, the passenger pigeon. There were so many passenger pigeons. There were billions, literally billions of passenger pigeons in the U.S. And they were so plentiful that you could see them flying by for hours, a big giant flock. And then in 1810, people were talking about this gigantic flock, 2 billion birds. 100 years later, in Cincinnati, the last passenger pigeon died, and that species was extinct. People thought there's no way ever that the passenger pigeon could go extinct. It's so plentiful, so abundant, but now there's no more. So that's an example. But let's talk about this actual scale of extinction. That passenger pigeon, we were destroying their habitat, we were shooting them, and there were things that we were introducing that were affecting their population. Well, if you look at the background rate of extinction, so if you look in the fossil record, then you can get an estimate of how many species there are, how often these species go extinct. You can trace this over the billions of years that living things have been on Earth, millions of years that a lot of familiar things have been on Earth. And so if you look at the rate of extinction, there's mass extinction, so there's a lot of species that have gone extinct at once that we'll look at next. But if you average that out, the number of species that have gone extinct versus the number of years that have gone by, the average over time, over millions and actually billions of years of the Earth's history, is about one species a year. An extinction of one species every year. That is the average. That's the background. That's a historical average over millions and millions of years of living things on Earth. There's these mass extinctions, like I said. So it's not like you have 1 year, one species gone. 1 year, one species gone. One year, you might have 100 species that go extinct, but the next 100 years, you hardly have any go extinct. So the average is about one per year. And then along come humans. Humans have been around for 200,000 years or so, and it's just over the last couple of centuries, maybe a little longer than that, 1,000 years or so, that we've been especially good at making things go extinct. First, though, let's look at this natural phenomenon of mass extinctions. So there's been a lot of species come and gone. People estimate that most of the species that have ever been on Earth, in the history of Earth, they're extinct. They're gone now. We've got several million species on Earth now. No one knows exactly how many, but maybe there's 10 million species, maybe there's 5 million. There's millions of species. There's a lot of them that have gone extinct, though. And if you look at the geological record, if you look at the fossil record, there's these mass extinctions. So in this figure below here shows these different eras in the past, and this orange peaks there are the number of species that have gone extinct, the extinction rate, in other words. So there's a mass extinction that levels off, then there's another mass extinction, and it levels off, another mass extinction, another mass extinction, another mass extinction. So there's been, as I said, there's hundreds of species that have gone extinct. And over the last 570 million years, 50% of the species on Earth have gone extinct. So this is a pattern that repeats itself. There's a big, giant meteor that hits Earth. There's a bunch of volcanic activity that sends up a bunch of debris into the atmosphere that interferes with the light and photosynthesis and the amount of energy. There's the changing of the temperatures. There's a number of different reasons why things go extinct. Some, people even, you can find things on the internet about aliens from outer space, those kind of aliens coming and being responsible for extinctions. There's a whole bunch of different reasons. So, if we look at the reason for these extinctions, historically there were these mass extinctions, but now, especially since the humans, the extinction rate, historically, remember, the extinction rate was about 1 extinction per year. Now, it's about 1 extinction per day. So everybody, regardless of your math skills, if you're not including leap years, you could calculate that that's about 365 times higher than the background rate of extinction. 365 times more extinctions are taking place, primarily at the hands of humans, than happened over the history of the Earth, over millions and millions and billions of years. And just recently, in the last 70 years or so, we used to kill things, we used to hunt things, we used to exploit different species because we had to feed ourselves. And that was the main reason for extinctions. Recently, there's a lot of extinctions that have taken place for other reasons. There's a lot of extinctions that took place on islands. We'll look at that. And we'll look at these main reasons for extinctions. Right now, this exploitation has been replaced by habitat destruction and habitat fragmentation. That's the number one cause of extinctions now. We're not even hunting these things. We're not even trying to kill these things. We're just destroying their habitat, fragmenting their habitat, and that leads to their populations not being able to survive and go extinct. So, those are the factors responsible for extinctions, and that is countering biodiversity. That's an obstacle to maintaining biodiversity. That's what we'll start looking at on Monday for our last lecture of this class.